Welcome to Net Podsitive. Today, we're exploring what it takes to really decarbonize at scale with Vincent Martinez, CEO of Architecture 2030. Vincent has spent nearly 2 decades helping shift decarbonization from an edge case conversation into a mainstream expectation by turning targets into action through networks, education, private sector commitments, and policy. Welcome to the conversation, Vince. It's great to see you.
Hi, Richard. Great to be here.
Vincent, you're a systems builder for climate action in the built environment with nearly 20 years at Architecture 2030. You've helped move decarbonization from the margins to the center of practice by aligning what designers want to do with what markets, policy, and project delivery can actually support. But I'm really curious, and tell me a little more about who you are and your role about Architecture 2030, and what was one of those moments along your early career events that led you down this path? What was this like for you?
Well, I am trained as a civil environmental engineer in college. I actually went originally to Boston University to study aerospace engineering. And then I joked that I came back down to earth and studied civil and environmental engineering. And I think I wanted to like design my own house or something. It was probably in how I felt in college. It was like, am I going to work on some space shuttle or satellite for my entire career that may not go up? Or do I want to do something that maybe I could use myself? That was probably it. And I went in engineering because I was, good at math and science, and that's what you were told to do. And there were careers in engineering. And so I studied that, and I was interested in the idea of sustainability, but there was really very little of that at the time. This was in the early 2000s, and ended up graduating with a structural engineering degree and moving back to Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is where I'm from originally. Long history in northern New Mexico for my family, going back like 16 generations. So I should go back and spend some time with the family and sort of just see what was there for me. And I still got a small job at a small engineering firm. Really just didn't feel right for me. Like it didn't feel like enough of a problem to be solving. And at the time, I learned in the Santa Fe New Mexican, which is our local newspaper, full page spread in color in the Sunday edition about this local architect that was shutting down his architecture practice and starting this nonprofit to focus on climate change in the built environment. And it's like, wow, this sounds like more like what I want to be doing. And so I think the process was I reached out, and I reached out to Ed Mazria, who was starting this, and via a connection I had with his daughter actually in high school. I'd never met Ed, but I knew his daughter, and so I reached out to her on AOL Instant Messenger. And I said, "Hey, is this your dad?" And she said, "Yeah, it's my dad." And I said, "Well, I'd like to meet him." And so she helped me arrange a meeting. Well, the story goes that Ed thought that I was, he heard from his daughter that I was depressed and I was looking for a different job. Maybe he knew all the other structural engineers in town and could find, the right spot for me. And so I think he was a little shocked when, we went out for a beer, and he's literally, people are bringing boxes out of the office that day to start, take all the architecture work and go somewhere else. And he and I went out for a beer and said, well, I want to work with you. And he's like, well, what do you mean? We don't know what we're doing. I said, that's okay. And he's like, well, we don't have any money. And I was like, that's all right. I'll see you on Monday. And I quit my job. I volunteered tutoring math and science at the high school and just started volunteering with Architecture 2030. And we was one of the original employees, and we got a local grant from a local philanthropy to kind of cover our time. And we were just trying to figure things out. We were just exploring what was happening. And I'd already done a lot of really important work, like 3 years earlier, with some of the original articles that he had written. But that was like my right place, right time kind of story. But also hey, it takes some guts, I suppose, to quit your job and figure it out. But I was young enough; I didn't have a lot of bills to pay, and if I had savings and I could figure it out. And but I was passionate about it, and just sort of evolved with the organization over the last 20 years, which has been great. I mean, which an amazing opportunity to just sort of have such a huge mission, which I know we haven't talked about yet, but we will. And just to say, there's a lot of flexibility in that. I wasn't, a CAD monkey sitting back at a desk, just cranking out drawings all day. I was getting to interact with people and try to tackle real big problems. Just everything's a people problem, really. I mean, that we have technological solutions or design solutions. It's just trying to get the good word out and get people to be motivated and do that work. And working, I think I like your intro, like working within the market and the systems to see what is possible and show that. And we've always been optimists at our organization. I'm an optimist, and I think it was reflected in that work.
Take me back to that time again. Had you read some of the articles that Ed had posted? Did you see, were
Yeah.
you part of the wave making during that
No,
time?
no. I mean, I was still a kid. I was in college. I was playing music and doing other things and riding my bike around and doing normal college kid stuff. I was really unaware. I think maybe in my research, I remember at one point I was like, I should go to more .org websites. Like, why am I on all these .com websites? But I discovered .orgs, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. It's actually like a gateway into other people's kind of work on mission driven things. And I remember learning about like Cobb houses in Oregon or something.
Yeah.
As it was in college. I mean, I lived in Seattle in college, so it's like, oh, this is interesting. And I remember growing up with Adobe houses in New Mexico. Like my parents' first
Mm-hmm.
house that they built was made out of
Mm-hmm.
Adobe. So like I was into the natural material ideas, and I had understood the components of passive solar design when I first was introduced to it. In fact, in college, the one sustainability course was actually not in civil and environmental engineering at University of Washington at the time. It was in the mechanical engineering department, and it was called, what was it called? Like Design for Sustainability or something like that. And it was all about life cycle assessment. And we had this really tight
Mm-hmm.
book about life cycle assessment and understanding. And then we had to do a project, which was we created a rating system because I think at that point we had learned about LEED. Like it could just come out or something. So we created a rating system for passive solar design. And in all of my research, I never came across Ed Mazria's book from 1979, the like pivotal book, the passive solar
Mm-hmm.
energy. We did not come across that. I don't know why. We read about the Balcomb's work and other people from New Mexico, but not Ed's. And we put together like a passive solar rating system thing, which is totally weird. There's a lot of really interesting, like synergistic connections that go back all the way from me and being in high school with
Mm-hmm.
Ed. It's just kind of interesting. It's like I was in this orbit or something.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I took that course and I learned about passive solar design there. And when I went back to New Mexico, I did take a ecological building kind of like volunteer course thing where you create a solar oven to bake cookies, that kind of stuff. That's very New Mexico. And I remember they actually introduced me to its book. So I had known a little bit about that, I think probably before I reached out to him. I
Mm-hmm.
can't remember the order of operations. That might have been right after I met him. Either way, I was in the world, I suppose, a little bit and tangentially, but I didn't really know anything. I didn't know what we were doing. I remember my first real thing at 2030 was like, oh, there's this group called ASHRAE. I was like, what is ASHRAE?
That's
So
when you
anyway,
had to figure out how to
yeah,
pronounce
I
it.
had to figure out that long acronym. So anyway, like a lot of like learning as I go. And I was in, mostly we dealt with building operations, and I was not a mechanical engineer. I was a structural. Like I had to learn all of that stuff from scratch. And I credit a lot of different people and along my journey that sort of supported my education and my leadership building skills. And I learned a lot of energy stuff when I moved to San Francisco. I was still working for 2030. We can talk a little bit more about my history, but I lived in San Francisco for about a year and went to this thing called the Pacific Energy Center, which is a basically ratepayer funded kind of, it's an energy efficiency lab funded by PG&E. And there's this guy named Bill Burke who kind of helped run the center. And I would go to courses on daylighting and mechanical system efficiencies and all sorts of stuff. It was really cool. And it was all free. Like, I mean, maybe I paid like $5 or something to
Mm-hmm.
go. But that was like my on the ground education. Who was there at the Pacific Energy Center, and I learned a lot there from Bill and the rest of the team. They have the Heliodon doing all like the shading stuff, and they had a daylighting lab kind of thing. So it was really cool.
And that hands-on type of experience and seeing kind of the physicality of that, it captures me. I mean, that's like take me to the science museum any day. I love that sort of hands-on diagramming and seeing how solar patterns move and affect shapes.
Yeah,
Did you find
yeah.
yourself being sort of hooked by that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I did enjoy it, and I learned a lot, and it put something that was, conceptual into a physical reality, which is really cool. I mean, I was always a big fan of children's museums. Santa Fe had a great one, and I actually volunteered there as like my community service in high school. So like, I feel like there's probably a connection there too, in terms of, an engineering brain, science brain, and just like seeing the physical manifestation of it. I That was
Hmm.
really cool. Again, it was all new to me. I didn't know anything about any of that stuff. And then later on, when I moved back to Seattle after living in San Francisco, I spent a lot of time at the Integrated Design Lab at the University of Washington, which also
Hmm.
had, I don't think they had a Heliodon, but they had a daylighting lab, like, you know, like, I can't remember exactly what they call it. It's like a room you can go in and it simulates a cloudy atmosphere, which of course is Seattle most of the time. But yeah, they're just really cool to kind of see these models and how people were using them. And the IDL, Integrated Design Lab, did a lot of like early energy modeling and design consulting for a lot of firm projects in the region that were high performance. So it was cool. That was all ratepayer funded too, for the most part. They stopped really doing a lot of that project design work, but just really cool to kind of see how it was getting put into practice.
And I would imagine too that along the way, being part of an industry think tank and industry related nonprofit is that you had a great ability to reach into design firms and both learn from them, but also advocate for the work that you were doing. Tell me a little bit about that and what that looked like for you along the way.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about people, honestly, and it's kind of interesting. Anytime you refer to an organization, you're referring to people within the organization, really, and
Mm-hmm.
that's how it makes decisions and how you interact with it. And we were lucky, I think, that the mission that we had set out to do in it, with Architecture 2030, when it was launched, even before Ed launched the challenge, just the fact that we were highlighting this issue for designers, is that designers were meant to make the world a better place. That's what they were taught to do, and figure out
Mm-hmm.
complex systems and individual program needs. And so like we were already working with the Coalition of the Willing. So that's a benefit. We weren't trying to like
Mm-hmm.
change people's minds, really,
Mm-hmm.
things that they were just blind to. They understood this very quickly. Maybe they didn't already know it, but it was a very quick turn, which we see now in the performance data about how well we're doing. It's like they took ownership of it right away. And I think it was a really collaborative environment where everybody was on the same page about trying to make improvements. And so you meet a lot of people along the way. I joke that there's this theory that you make a new friend group every 7 years, and I feel like
I could believe that.
I feel like that's how it was with my work life as well. Like just getting the lay of the land and working with a lot of the first program that I did was the AIA professional education series. I mean, it wasn't really the first. We did a bunch of other things, but the first one that really got me out into the community. And that was a partnership with AIA Seattle and Architecture 2030, and we did this in-person session in Seattle. It was like super successful. Sold out 60 participants, and then it sold out again the next year. And then all these other AIA, they call them components, but they're chapters, right? Around the country were like, oh, we need that too. That sounds really good. So we kind of created a replicable model. So I was flying around the country, just like introducing the sessions and doing the trainings with the people that would give them. And I just met so many amazing people. And that's where I got connected, not just to the firms, but to the AIA components as well. And then
Mm-hmm.
meet the firms in the sessions, and I'd meet the speakers that were going to present over the course of the 10 series. So I met like tons and tons of people. I still wish that like I had been on LinkedIn or something back then so I could have kept track of everybody. But a huge community. I mean, it went through 26 markets, and, figured out at least that it reached a potential of a third of AIA's membership. So 30,000 people, like it potentially could have gone to those series. That we didn't reach that many at the training, but just to give you a sense of the scope. And they're doing great work. I think that that's really a testament again to the altruism and the passion and focus of all these people and what they're trying to achieve, and that it was a welcoming community. There was no heads in the sand, like this isn't real, we're not going to deal with it. Like it was, let's tackle it. And I've learned a lot from all of those people along the way. Every single person has influenced my thinking.
Well, I can imagine so. And I also imagining here too that you've gotten to see the practice change over time. Tell me a little bit about that, if you would. Where have you seen design change itself in form or in systems, materials, cost, aesthetics? What have you
Yeah.
seen over 2 decades?
Well,
I
first
mean,
I'll say that I'm not in practice. So, this is a high level bird's eye view of what's on the ground. Like it's really the colleagues that are practitioners that really understand a lot of the nuances. But in overall trends, I think what's really interesting, and it goes back even before my career, right? Like you look at the start of a lot of this movement came in the first oil crisis and the energy crisis in the 70s. And that's what made Ed write his book and focus on passive design. And there was like a real big movement. And this might have just been a New Mexico feeling for me too, of like this, like, let's use the knowledge that we have from traditional senses. And that was, I felt that with Adobe architecture early on, and it was less about the materials now, but even just passive design was built into like our way of thinking and living. Like my mother helped kind of design our house. She's not a designer. She just was like kind of influencing how the builder was going to lay out the house
Mm-hmm.
with the living room. And she wanted
Mm-hmm.
views. If she wanted the sun to come in from the south, and she understood some of those things without any
Mm-hmm.
knowledge
Mm-hmm.
or professional or educational knowledge. So I think there's some of that was sort of ingrained. And I think that was really appealing to me personally, is these passive strategies, these general design strategies. Like that's kind of really cool. Like it's amazing. You can just think and apply no cost, low cost ideas to make something better. And then there was this move in the 80s. Again, this predates me. I was born in the 80s. It was just like, let's focus on a technology. Technology is the answer. I'm sorry, what was the question? Kind of approach. It's like, let's just make these things as
Insert technology here.
yeah, as work on energy efficient technologies or some whiz bang energy production gizmo thing, and we sort of changed the course. And I would say when I came on board, it was a more holistic kind of approach with design, included. It wasn't just about mechanical system efficiency or things like that. So that was appealing to me. I think where we've come over the last 20 years is that there was a much led by us, a primary focus on energy from or operating emissions. So,
Mm-hmm.
and then we called it fossil fuel energy consumption when we were talking about operations. And in that fossil fuel energy consumption, I think we are much to blame for this as anybody else. Is to say we focused on the energy part of that instead of the fossil fuel part of that. Is
Mm-hmm.
like and it is the design community's primary lever. Is you have a lot of control in both passive and active systems of reducing the energy demand. And that it should be first and foremost and always should be. But we didn't spend as much time talking about the things that are actually input into the building, whether we're powering that building with fossil fuels or clean sources of energy. That was embedded in the challenge. Like there's a little asterisk on the 2030 goal that says no fossil fuels to operate, no emissions to operate, kind of thing, which implied things that we talk about now, like building electrification and renewables. But I think at the time, it was focused on like, let's pull the lever we have the strongest ability to do that's no cost, low cost, and it's led through design, and that's energy efficiency. And
Mm-hmm.
that's great, but we could have an energy efficient fossil fuel power building. So, I think that's part of the thing that's evolved over time. And then the other piece is around the larger scope of emissions for buildings, particularly. It's not just about building operations. We now call it embodied carbon, right? The emissions associated with building materials and construction practices. And then that has evolved. We were earlier leads on that. I remember working in the late 2000s, like 2008 and 9 on that, some of that early work, trying to understand it. It was also part of Ed's pie charts back in 2003, which I could share some interesting stories about that later. But then more recently, we've been expanding. It's not just about buildings, that the embodied carbon goes into infrastructure. The same amount of concrete and steel and aluminum, and actually more aluminum goes into infrastructure. Those are the high impact materials. So I think our scope is expanding, not just about energy, not just about operating emissions, not just about embodied carbon through buildings, but through infrastructure. And then when we get into this larger scale, now all sorts of other opportunities emerge. We talked with landscape architects about
Mm-hmm.
nature-based solutions that are both carbon sequestering solutions and low energy solutions on emissions from materials. They're also adaptation strategies for lower heat island effect and better stormwater management and sea level rise mitigation and flooding. Like awesome. Like this is so cool. Now we're in this wholly different spectrum. We also talk about urban planning decisions that affect how buildings are laid out and set us up for success or failure just based off of our regional planning and local planning work, density and other things. So there's a whole big universe, I think, certainly that I've been becoming more and more aware of and trying to find those practitioners that really have the thought leadership in those spaces to learn from. And then how does that get embedded to our work and our strategies to support them in achieving those goals as well? It's a large tent and a large scope. And we can tackle on pieces of it at a time and feel successful in those pieces, but there's always more to do.
How do you feel the evidence is starting to shake out now that you've gotten nearly 2 decades of metrics starting to accumulate, able to analyze trends and see sort of the data moving forward? Have we started to achieve the goals of Architecture 2030 and really decoupling energy dependence from buildings?
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I just said. It's like, what is the scope? Each scope, and we have to evaluate each one separately. We can't look at it as a whole, and we also can't look at it as sort of a binary pass-fail kind of equation. So what we set out to do originally with our flagship initiative back in 20 years ago was the 2030 challenge, which was a set of fossil fuel energy reduction challenges, incremental for new buildings and major innovations, a subset of the built environment. It wasn't for all buildings everywhere. And it ratcheted down, and it was focused on fossil fuel energy reduction. And so how have we done towards that? Well, it's hard to tell because we don't have data specifically for all new buildings and all major renovations to know if that's really the case. I mean, we can look at policy mechanisms in different areas that mandate or require that and are on track to making that the standard in 2030 for sure. That exists, like places like California and other progressive code adopting states. That's where what it'll look like. But we do have a lot of information sort of at the macro level of the full building stock. And there's a lot of great progress there. If you look just at building operations over the last 20 years, we've added about 72 billion square feet of new buildings, essentially 44 cities the size of Chicago. But despite adding all that new construction, the whole building stock has reduced its energy consumption by 8% and its emissions by over 30%.
Wait, see, that's a pretty important detail. Say that line again. We've expanded the number of buildings and reduced the overall energy intensity.
The overall, not just the intensity, which is important, but the total demand. So, in 2005, we used about 40 kPTUs of energy in the building sector. We can talk about what those metrics meant. Like we're actually 8% below that number 20 years later. So it's not that like we just reduced the intensity of the building stock. We did it at scale enough to bring down the total demand for energy and electricity. And then again, because we kept that demand flat and lowered it, that allowed for renewable energy on the utility grid, which buildings consume about 75% of electricity in the US. That allowed for us to reduce our emissions even more dramatically down in the 30% range from 2005 levels. So, huge success story and a decoupling of growth of the built environment from energy consumption and operations, but it's only part of the story, right? Well, what about all the embodied carbon associated with those 44 cities the size of Chicago building development? Well, we don't have data to measure that, whether it's nationally or internationally, really. So obviously we know that emissions were produced in order to create all those buildings. So we can't ignore that. And we have to tackle that issue as well. And then we have a global space, and we don't necessarily see that same decoupling at the global level yet. We don't see as tight of a curve as we raise the amount of floor area. We don't raise the energy consumption or emissions the same percentages. So that shows we're starting to get a decoupling, but it's not as much of a trajectory that we see in the US. Europe has that same trajectory, so that's great. But overall in the globe, we're just building so much, honestly. That's a big part of it, which goes back to embodied carbon and the planning and regional scale stuff. But we're just building so much that even if it's efficient, it's still using some sort of energy, and in many cases it's still fossil fuel based, although the large majority of new development capacity for electricity is renewables across the globe. It's lots to celebrate and more work to do.
Are existing building stock part of the opportunity to succeed here?
Yeah, they're part of the aggregated statistic of that decoupling. So some of that ability is for new buildings to come on more efficient, and some of it is about existing buildings being renovated to being more efficient. Again, it's hard to unpack that in the macro data. But yeah, existing building renovation is really the majority of type of design that actually is in billable hours for architects. So AIA has a chief economist that has tracked this for years now. It's moving this way since the recession. I think in the recession, it was probably like 30% billable hours for renovation, 70% for new construction. And we passed the halfway point of that, I think, a few years ago. And so now the majority of billable hours are for renovation projects. We're just not building as much in the US anymore compared to renovating, which is great. We're turning in more like Europe with existing building stock that needs to get that we need to get a handle on. And we could spend a whole hour talking about existing buildings too, Richard. So I'll keep it brief and just to say, it's a win-win on embodied carbon and operation to renovate an existing building, because you can help decarbonize the energy systems that are in that building and reduce its energy consumption and move to cleaner fuels. And then you also, in theory, are not building a new building from scratch. You're putting people into that older building, the asset. We're taking advantage of the embodied carbon in the building instead of building new. So, there's a really big wins there. Again, we could spend a lot of time on this, but the big piece is that there's a lot of buildings. Just think about, let's assume we have to decarbonize all of them in the next 30 years by 2050. That's 3% a year will get us 90% of the way there. So that's a lot. We only renovate about 1% right now of the building stock yet. So you need these accelerators to touch more and more buildings. And there are a couple policy mechanisms that do that right now. One is building performance standards, which are for the larger buildings, usually about 50,000 square feet and above. Those are buildings that have fairly complex systems. There's a small number of them. I think it's depending on the city, like between 5 and 10% of the total quantity of buildings are in that. And they are the majority contributors, especially given their floor area and their uses. And those building performance standards ratchet the performance of the building, either energy or emissions, up every 5 years, or down, up, however you want to call it. And that's what we'll get to those buildings, the big ones, and they're complex, and they'll figure out a way to do it. They'll work with design. Hopefully we'll look at whole building strategies like envelope improvements as well. But then you've got hundreds of thousands of small buildings, and that's 90% of the building stock. And so that's a totally different type of mechanism. And we look at building intervention points and how to your point about market and policy can align with that, as saying, when is a good time to do this? If we can't tackle it all at once, can't just snap our fingers. We don't have a magic lamp, say everybody's just going to do it. And if we did it, we couldn't have the workforce to do it. And it'd be super expensive for everybody to switch out their systems. That said, we know where the emissions are. They're in the heating systems for hot water and space heating. So you could be more prescriptive in those approaches, and you can leverage what we call building intervention points. In Europe, they call them trigger points, which are times in the building's life cycle when either money's exchanging hands anyway and there's financing, or when work's going to be done on the building. So time of sale is an example, when the building's being sold or exchanging hands. Time of renovation, time of equipment replacement should be the catch-all. Like, that's how we got rid of the incandescent light bulb. You just can't buy them anymore. They died, and then you have to buy it. At the time, it was a CLF or complex fluorescent, CFL, sorry. And now it's an LED. That's the new system, and that's just what you're going to use. So when we're replacing, then there's an incremental cost, a very, very small one, if any, between switching from a fossil fuel system to a renewable-based system. So that's important. And that should be a standard practice as a catch-all. But there's these other intervention points. Sometimes it's about resiliency. Like, sometimes we're upgrading a building for seismic renovation in an earthquake zone, or sometimes we're putting a building on stilts in a floodplain. Like, okay, great, work's being done, do the decarbonization at the same time. That's the idea. Right? And that's what can get us from a 1% a year renovation rate to a 3% a year renovation rate.
Well, you have my mind really spinning between the project team and policy and all of the opportunities that enhance the life of a building goes through. I'm kind of reflecting back on that, what has changed over the last 20 years. Where have you seen some of the leverage points change as clients become more sophisticated, as financial organizations are scrutinizing these kinds of conversations more? You've got education amongst practitioners changing and developing over time. Where are you seeing the leverage points start to move? Are they moving closer to centers of power?
That's an interesting question, Richard. I think back to the original topic of this community and their willingness to dive into this problem. And again, the built environment is very complex. There are a lot of stakeholders, but for the majority of time of our work, Architecture 2030 works primarily with design professionals. We do work with policymakers. We work with existing building owners and managers, all sorts of folks, international policymakers. But let's just take the design community. And I think the design community recognize their agency and their abilities, and then are now recognizing their constraints. So when we launched the original 2030 challenge, the original target, the very first target for the first year, was a 50% reduction. cut in half immediately. And most people were like, what?
What?
In half? Like, how are we going to do that? But we knew enough about how design worked that you could do that. Like that we were very excessive in our energy use, and it was fairly actually straightforward to get to a 50% reduction from what we were typically using. And we did that through design, and practitioners took on that mantle and reached those goals really quickly. I think as we ratchet further and further, design professionals are recognizing that they can only do so much. They can only take it so far. Their agency only goes so far. There's ability to make an efficient building. Yes, check that box. They can do that. They can work to ensure that that building doesn't have on-site fossil fuels through their system choices, and working in collaboration with other design professionals, like mechanical engineers, and making the business case to clients for moving in that direction. But there's things that are also outside of their control, like the changing of their electricity grid to be clean, right? I mean, you can do so much. You could add on-site renewables in certain cases, but in many cases, there's hostile utility policy, large interconnection fees, lack of grid modernization that just prevents you even from putting any solar on the building. Lack of net metering policy is another example that doesn't make an economic case for it. So, there's a constraint there. I think they're pushing on that limit now and recognizing, oh, shoot, we can't always do it here. They're trying to find ways to become more advocates to support things in the system. So that exists. I think that like we're recognizing where we're reaching our limitations through design and where we need to become advocates and support other positions. But that's designers. Like if you look at all these other folks, there's all sorts of different stakeholders that are learning where they can take control. And I think that there is a growing recognition that we need to think beyond buildings and think at larger system scale pieces. That's the electricity grid piece there, but it includes things at the urban planning and infill and density levels, for example, in urban environments, nature-based solutions. All of these things require us to have partnerships between not just design professionals, but community and policymakers and local governments to actually see those things into the future. So I think we're getting a sense that in order to tackle the problems that we really need to tackle, we need to work at scale. And scale means a different level of collaboration than just your private siloed autonomy.
Is there, from your view, an underrated power position or a position on a project team, someone who actually could change the outcome of this project, but may not always be recognized for that ability? What I'm driving at is, are there any levers that an emerging professional may be able to pull, or someone who interfaces with design every day that they can apply directly in to their work and start to build that power position of influence to really help direct design?
Yeah, I understand your question. It's an interesting one. I'll jump higher scale for a minute, and then I'll come back down to the practitioner level. I have been a big advocate in understanding a lot larger systematic issues and how a grouping of organizations or individuals will work together to complete something big. And bringing this back to the design professional side is that we talk about integrated design and integrated design process, bringing all these disciplines in together early to solve complex problems. And most large firms, by the way, are integrated firms. They have different disciplines together because these issues are so big. Is that the interconnectedness piece is what number one, it makes the project stronger, because if you pull one, it's like a weaving or a tapestry. If you pull one thread, the whole thing kind of falls apart. So it makes it really difficult to pull things out. And if we look at that at the larger scale with industry organizations and pieces, we often remain in silos and focus on one particular piece. And that may be the case in design practice. I don't know. I've never practiced. So I think what we neglect to understand it and ignore is the interconnections with one another. So I often talk about, even in a machine, there are small gears and there are big gears. And sometimes a small gear can move a big gear, and sometimes a big gear moves a medium gear. What is really necessary is not necessarily just to understand your own role and responsibility, your own little gear or big gear, by that means, but all the other ones. What other ones are you touching? Even if you're not directly influencing them, which ones does your gear moving, that gear moving, this gear affect somewhere else? And so I think that the same could be said probably for designers in practice, is that recognizing that you don't necessarily need to know about your thing, you need to know about everybody's thing, at least to some level, so you can understand what your roles and influences are, even if they're indirect. And my advice to young professionals that are getting into the space is, and I've done some presentations at universities and other things, and I say the same thing every time. It's find a niche go explore, go volunteer somewhere, learn something new, bring something to your firm that they don't currently have, and then understand how it connects to all of the other work. And I think that's partially my freedom and privilege at Architecture 2030 to have been able to do that. Like I didn't get, like I mentioned earlier, get siloed into a desk and having to work on one particular thing and being overly directed. I had a lot of freedom in my ability in my career to grow and introduce myself into new groups and learn more things and think about how it applied to our mission, and then try to develop networks to implement it. And I think the same should be done for more designers, and that means firms should pay attention to that too, and not just silo and put people in one role, but give them some freedom to go learn and bring new things to the field.
That just seems like a life tip.
Yeah, for sure. That is a like actually I know part of your podcast rates on like eco anxiety and centering yourself. And I actually talk with colleagues about this a lot. I think the key to anything, in my opinion, is having balance. If you put all your eggs in one basket, when that basket falls, they're all broken and you're left sunk. But if you're in balance, if you've got eggs in multiple baskets, if you're focused and have passion in different places, then yeah, when one thing goes wrong, you have resilience and you can go find passion and excitement in something else while that one gets repaired. So just don't overly silo yourself or overly invest in one thing. Be diverse.
I love that. Hey, so this is actually a good segue into my next kind of set of questions. You write songs, you've got a lot of talent and singer-songwriter, particularly in the folk genre, and there's a lot of history of storytelling there, of our humanity, oral storytelling. Tell me where you see art and culture starting to, let me start that over. Tell me where art and culture interfaces in your world. Does it enhance your work? Do you find that there's any bleed over? But also, I'm really curious to see how art influences life and vice versa.
Yeah, great questions, and ones I honestly don't often think about. It's just part of going through the journey. And sometimes I think that sometimes my worlds are separated too much. Talk about diversity, and eggs in different baskets. Maybe I haven't even quite understood my own connections in my own world. But yeah, like you said, I am a songwriter and a musician. I play guitar, I sing. They're experiencing, and I'm just inspired by amazing songwriters across the board, and hopefully I can contribute to that dialogue in one way. That's not my profession. I'm not out there on the road, but the people that do get to communicate on the internet's an amazing opportunity for creativity to be shared. So that's nice. Don't think I've really put my creative lens through our work at Architecture 2030 specifically until more recently. And I don't know if that was because I feel like I inherited or wanted to be true to Ed's vision and his messages. I mean, I think we aligned so well on so many things. Like I'm an optimist. He's optimistic. He's very positive in the viewpoint. I feel the same way. Like, let's talk about solutions and actions. That's embedded in my voice, my personal voice. And that was in the organization, which is fine. Why I found such a strong home here. But I don't think I've really kind of explored the creativity aspects. I feel like Architecture 2030 is I remember when we had some of that earlier on by our old director, like these really creative ways. We had this thing called the Solar Cat. There was a book, and we would show little videos of the Solar Cat finding the place. And there were a lot of really interesting creative things that we did early on. And I kind of wanted us to be more of an honest broker and being like a little bit more serious. And I remember Ed and I were in agreement about that for Architecture 2030. But I think you need creativity. I mean, designers are storytellers. They tell stories to their clients, and then they create a manifestation of that story and that people interact with. I love puns. Like I love being creative through that kind of thing. For sure. That you see that in my songwriting. I love alliteration. I use that a lot. And I think that those things do kind of come across. I remember we had an intern from the University of Massachusetts Amherst that helped us with our carbon smart materials palette, and he was working on our concrete swatches. And he had a wonderful pun. It was like collaboration is the cure. And if you're a concrete nerd, curing. But those things are fun. I think we have to bring in a little bit of joy and jovialness into serious situations too, in order to move forward. That's actually how I ingest my news about the world and keep track is through comedians, because it's just easier to kind of process. But I think the creativity piece of songwriting has always shown people a reflection of what's going on in the world. And that has been part of my songwriting journey for a long time. Like I remember writing really early on songs about climate change before I was really even in this space very deeply. I had a song called Oso Blanco, the polar bear, basically.
Mm-hmm.
He's going out of style because he doesn't have a North Pole anymore. It's these kind of things that were embedded, watching the ice melt, all sorts of stuff. And I
Right.
remember I wrote a song for the book club, which if anybody is interested, you can go find. It's called the Bushwick Book Club Seattle. And maybe if
Mm-hmm.
you have liner notes, you could include a link to this recording.
Oh,
We did it.
absolutely.
We did it at the Experience Music Project in Seattle, which is now called the MoPop Museum of Popular
Mm-hmm.
Culture. Right in Gary Building, actually. Really cool building. And the book was science fiction themed. It was Isaac Asimov's Foundation. And it was always
Mm-hmm.
made it to an Apple TV series more recently, but it was back in like the 30s or 40s. It was a pretty old book. And my song, it's a long book, and we don't have a lot of time to go into the details, but it's about like generational, century long changes in
Right.
history, and that some things change, and
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you need to like embrace the new thing that's coming along and let go of the old thing, and that's both generationally wise and people wise and technology wise and culturally wise, all these things. And my song is about that, and it's called Crisis Mode. And it's
Mm-hmm.
really in the book, which was picked up by Thomas Friedman, quotes about crisis, that during a moment of crisis, we don't look for new solutions. We pick up things that are off the ground. There are all these crisis points within the Foundation book series where it's either basically humanity is gone, or we make a change. And I feel like
Mm-hmm.
we're in that moment with climate change. So that's what the song is about. And if folks are interested in hearing it, they can go listen to it. But I think it's still as true now as I wrote it probably 10 years ago.
I absolutely agree. Well, and it comes from the heart, and I love this. I'd be happy to both share and take a listen. This is amazing. So, Vincent, I'd love to ask you a couple of wild card questions here, and a bit of a transition. So, just sort of off the top of my head, you mentioned that what are some bright spots that you see that you were unexpected by 2026? Something that you didn't expect to see, but is a bright spot along the way.
I am inspired by a growing movement at all levels, from the highest levels of business to grassroots organizations, a focus on culture and social change. We're part of the World Economic Forum. They spun off an effort with the Swiss government called the Davos Buckle Tour Alliance, and Buckle Tour is a word that means quality and culture. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the high level, right? Like these are high level business people working with high level cities across the world, and they're focusing on the fact that, like, hey, look, there's a reason that we have the type of design in our regions that we brought out of culture. Like, this is regional, this is culturally specific, this is climate responsive, and we need to value that and show that there is value there, and valorize it, and say that this is the kind of thing we should do in these regions, and we don't need to do what somebody else did. We can learn from our own culture and heritage. And then we have other efforts coming out of Germany as well, with a thing called Shift, which is focused on heritage solutions for the pre-fossil fuel age. Like, how did we design buildings and systems, and how can we learn from that, not to go backwards, but to
Mm-hmm.
kind of go back to the future in a way, and adapt some of those strategies into new types of design. So that's happening. And then there's a group called the Climate Heritage Network, which is a network of networks focused on culture and heritage. And they've launched campaigns to recognize the importance of heritage and social change. This
Mm-hmm.
kind of goes all the way up to the level of the IPCC, which, if any of you follow any of the documentation about projections about where we could be and what kind of in terms of climate emissions and reductions we could have, they're kind of limited to focusing mostly on technological solutions, because those are the ones that can be more easily documented. And it's actually in the UN text that says that's the scope. And so there's a push between all levels to try to get that scope to be expanded and recognize it's not just about technology and emissions and very quantitative, but there's a quality here that's and an empowerment of people that are actually making those decisions. And we need to
Mm-hmm.
evaluate that, and we need to valorize that and give funding and resources to those folks that can actually make the change, whether that's in songwriting or storytelling or indigenous traditional ways and practices, community-based organizations, having advocacy groups or informational sessions, like all levels. But I think there's a recognition that it's not just about technology, but it's about people. And this isn't a difficult
Mm-hmm.
position in time for history when technology is rapidly adapting faster than anybody could have expected. And yet we have to find the humanity in all of it and decide
Mm-hmm.
at what point do we, follow that direction, or do we help use those tools to guide a different direction that values people, culture, and society, which is it kind of one of our existential challenges. We have many of them of our time. So I'm inspired by that. I don't think I really expected as much as I would love to have seen it. And when I started out, I talked about, feeling those internally just in growing up in New Mexico and Adobe architecture and passive design, like we're embedded without even understanding what those meant, right? They were just
Right.
what I grew up around. So that
Mm-hmm.
heritage is really important to me, especially as a long standing Northern New Mexican.
Mm-hmm.
Heritage
Mm-hmm.
is in my blood and my thought process. And it's wonderful to see that that's being recognized and valorized across the globe now in different spectrums. So that's not something I probably expected.
And that's pretty amazing to see how some of these traditional methodologies really will help us accelerate into the future. And I also really like this quote that you've now given about the tools during crisis we pick up from the ground.
Yeah.
That one's sticking with me.
Yeah, I'll send it to you so you can quote it correctly.
Thank you. Thank you for that muddle my way through that one. So here's another sort of off the top of my head random question. What phrase would you put on the decarbonization swear jar?
And
You got
can
a
you,
swear jar for decarbonization. Are you
like,
familiar
things
with
you
the
should
swear
say?
jar? What's that? Yeah, yeah, like the thing that you don't want to hear again. Or you could even think about what slide would you take out of that you would banish from a presentation deck? You could think about it either way. Like what's that topic that you wish people would just drop, like it's not adding to the conversation?
Oh, wow. I don't know, Richard. I wonder if you've stumped me here.
Ooh.
I mean, I just value so many different perspectives, and in everything I feel has a role and a place. So it's like, what is it? Was my pet peeve? What really bothers me? I don't know. It probably would depend on the context and like the situation, I suppose. Well, maybe this will be. It's not quite the same thing, but I'll do my best to answer your
Okay,
question.
let's do it. Lay it on me.
Is that it's not just about buildings.
Uh,
And I
yes.
have to change that even in our own language. Go through and we still find historic things where we say the building sector. Or
Yes.
we've now sort of completely moved on from that language and we talk about the built environment. So I think again, this is limited to our sector, and I would just say that's really important. Is change your mindset to thinking from buildings to the built environment, and all of a sudden, brand new things open up for you in this.
Mm-hmm.
And you really need it. Like we're not going to solve this on a building by building level. So I think that would be my number one.
I think that that's a perfect answer there. Shifting from building sector to built environment is a paradigm shift there.
Mhm.
Well, I want to transition to our last segment of our conversation. This has been wonderful. Thanks so much for spending a little time and invite you here to the community garden portion of our chat. And I know you and I have chatted about this a few times, but a quick little reminder. I would love to find out what's really blossoming in your world these days, your work, your life, everything that's going on. Find out a prickly problem that bringing blood to the fingertips and to hear what you see out on the horizon. So tell me what's fragrant, what's blossoming. It's spring around Seattle. Have you seen the, the flower buds?
Spring in February, it's wild.
It's wild.
I think what's blossoming, I would say there's probably two things that stand out to me. One is that people are starting to recognize the interconnections with each other,
Mm-hmm.
collaborate in a really profound way that we haven't really seen before. I think people are realizing their limitations. They're realizing they don't want to be competitive or redundant and ignore what else is going on. They're willing to come together. They're willing to sacrifice a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
of their own maybe agendas in order to find the larger of the collective whole. We were part of this wonderful group called the ECHO Project, Embodied Carbon Harmonization and Optimization, included a variety of different NGOs and industry organizations that were tracking embodied carbon. I really felt like it was a totally different kind of mindset that everybody came into and understood, and we worked together to achieve those goals. So like, I think that, and I'm seeing it more and more, we're doing with MEP 2040 is under our stewardship now, and that group is just incredible set of volunteers and supporters. I think that there's a big need. I mean, I think there was an old quote that was like, leadership, partnership is the new leadership. And I don't think it's partnership necessarily. I think it's like collaboration.
Hmm.
So I think this collaborative network is really growing, and that's a big part of my vision for the future is a lot more of the interconnections acting as the conduit and connective tissue for these larger issues and making sure people know about what everybody else is doing. Because sometimes we don't look up enough to like see that, oh wow, somebody
Hmm.
else already did this. We should learn from that and build on it. So that to me is blossoming. I think there's a collective understanding. I see that in the philanthropic community too, with coalitions of funders coming together to work in the same space rather than funding competitive work. So that's good.
Well, and you've even started to mention a problem, a prickly problem here is heads down, pushing forward into the work and not lifting your head up enough to see what's going on out there in the community. Are you seeing that happening sometimes?
No, I mean, I think that's a blossom. I'm not seeing that as much anymore. I think in the past we used to see that a little bit more. I mean, certainly, of course, it still exists.
Hmm.
I mean, honestly, maybe if my prickly problem might be a little bit, there's still so much focus on like the technological solutions. It's kind of
Mm, okay.
the of the like what I was excited about or surprised about culture is that there's just so much focus that like technology is going to fix this for us. I mean, you
Mm,
see this now, like data centers and like oh, we're going to have this tremendous demand, and the only way we can solve this is by building a bunch of new nuclear plants. Like, I'm not opposed to nuclear, but it's like a long way out, and it's got a lot of risks, and we've got a lot of other solutions that we should be focusing on before that. So I think there's still this like technology is the answer. I'm sorry, what was the question? And I think that that's proven on a macro scale, and it proves every day in our life with a lot of this AI stuff. It's like,
hmm.
you know, I mean, we're getting into some personal things, and maybe this is helpful for the eco anxiety things, but like, don't worry, you can stay in your home and just like talk to a chat bot, and that'll be your best friend, or it'll give you dating advice for how you can interact with people. And like, we lose the interconnections, and that's
Hmm.
what really makes us human and allows us to like transcend with difficult conversations and
Hmm.
sometimes and differences of opinions. Like, we need to interact with people. We're social animals, and I feel like this technological solution is apparently going to solve everything for us. Just takes us out of the equation. It's like, why are we even there? So
Right.
that to me is maybe my biggest thorn, and then they're big ones. It's not limited to our sector; it's
Hmm. Hmm.
society at large.
Well, and you've got young people in the house, so you can see how this affects their world.
Oh, giant influence on kids. You know, it's like social media on steroids. Yeah, and everybody makes their own personal decisions about parenting, but I think what's really difficult is that some of these things are so systematic that they are forced upon everyone, and that's the real.
Hmm.
It's how can you get off the train? Like, is there even a possibility, and how do we find our management of some of these with our kids, particularly? That's we could talk about that for another couple hours.
Well, tell me what's bringing you hope for the future. What's out there on the horizon when you look through your lens?
You know, I brought the collaboration as a bloom, but I think the hope for the future is that the solution sets have so many positive outcomes. So in the climate world, we're not just in mitigation mode anymore. Like, I've been at it
Mm-hmm.
for 20 years. Like, if we would have met the targets we needed to meet on the global stage, 10 years ago, maybe we could have avoided some of the worst effects of climate change. We're in adaptation mode as much as we still need to focus on mitigation. But I think that there is some that will just like, hey, it's all about adaptation now. Forget it. Let's just burn a bunch of more fuels and forget that we're actually contributing to more and more need for resilience. I don't think that that's the case. I think that we can find solutions, particularly again, if we look at higher scales like urban solutions and nature positive solutions, you can get both. You can get both mitigation strategies that are also adaptation strategies. I mentioned about nature-based solutions like cool corridors or planting and vegetation and bioswales, green roofs. All of those things support stormwater and flooding runoff. They support lower heat island effect. They're lower carbon solutions from a materials perspective. They're also more livable, clean air, clean water, all of these things. Like, great. Why wouldn't we do these things? This is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter what your outcome is. And I think that's where we get into this idea that it won't always be about decarbonization as much as I would want it. Maybe that's the slide I also take off. Is that we don't lead with decarbonization anymore. We lead with things that people care about. And decarbonization
Mm-hmm.
will come as a natural outcome of those solution sets. Most nature-based solutions are not done for decarbonization for the mitigation side. They're done for the adaptation and livability side. Some of these things are done for affordability, like energy efficiency is to help make sure you're not paying a bunch of money on your utility to build that you don't need to. Urban density is about affordability to try to make sure that we're not adding the cost of living and paying for transportation decisions to get to and from work. We can actually have a fully functional community and go to the doctor's office and school by foot, and live a different kind of lifestyle. We learned that in COVID. Like, who wants to go spend
Mm-hmm.
another 2 hours back in their car with all these forced to back to work mandates? Like, we understood now that there was a better way to live, and we need urban planning and businesses to get on board with different types of work. And that's something maybe technology can help with, right? Like, we're having this
Mm-hmm.
conversation. We're not very far from each other, but we saved an hour of our life on the road trying to get to each other to have this. So, I'm really optimistic about the fact that the wins for climate are going to be the wins for everything else. And so
Mm-hmm.
let's lead with the things people care about. And if you can't talk about climate or people don't care about decarbonization, then lead with things that they care about, and you're still going to get the same outcomes.
So if you just bring up so many questions, and I certainly want to be careful with your time because I could talk to you for hours. But one that struck me is about messaging, storytelling. I'm just sort of playing back our conversation, but also I'm curious about nerds versus enthusiasts. I used to call myself a green building nerd because I am, and had someone correct me that actually we're enthusiasts. We want to bring more people into this conversation. So I'm curious about the storytelling aspect by data and now analytics that can show proof in pudding versus storytelling of hearts and minds. Can
Mm.
you tell me where you see both roles of nerds and enthusiasts, and do we have a place in this cooperation together?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Richard. I mean, I remember reading this article now probably 10 years ago that, like, if it was a political article, so I'll put flag on that. And it was something like, if you provide data, people just dig in their heels more to their positions, right? So it's like
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
the analytical approach is not going to make or convince people. And I do think that that's true. I mean, we're in a subsector with a bunch of enthusiasts, to your point. So
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
people love that stuff and they'll get into it night and day. But you find that that's more internal. They're not using that to communicate externally, right? They're not, even if they have the data to back it up, they're maybe not leading with that in their conversations with clients or community. They're listening, which I think is really
mm-hmm,
important,
mm-hmm.
and then trying to find.
Analyzing and then turning that into a human readable form, right?
Well, that, yes, but I think that's mostly internally for their purposes, to like validate what the approach that they're taking, and know that's a good approach. It's sort of like iterative analysis, I would say, comparative analysis. Like,
Mm-hmm,
was this a good direction or is this a bad direction, kind of thing. I think what we have found is that most people should be listening to other people and their perspectives, and then finding a way to communicate with them directly. And that's more of the hearts and minds piece, I think, that you're talking about.
mm-hmm,
Not to say that data isn't important. We need to know that we're going in the right direction. That's the evolutionary trait of humanity. It's like, well, pathway A leads us to danger and pathway B leads us to safety. Let's go pathway B. Like, let's learn from our
mm-hmm,
past histories. But I don't think that's so much the issue. I think it's about communication and the hearts and minds piece. I think we have enough data, understanding of the technological solutions, understanding of the approaches that we should be taking that back up those points. It's just about how do we help build the case through what people do care about, again, is part of a communication message. It's all about people. It's not
mm-hmm.
really about technology or science or physics to fix this problem. It's just about how do we relate to each other.
Hey, I want to wrap up our episode here and get us back on track. But you've mentioned both Pacific Northwest, where we share in this bountiful beauty, and also New Mexico area. You've gotten to live in San Francisco, various places across the earth. But tell me where one of your most favorite places in nature is. Where do you like to go and recharge and regenerate yourself?
I've got two places probably. One is for like a sanctuary, is my mother-in-law's house in Santa Fe, and she lives at the edge of the Santa Fe National Forest, and it's just beautiful. And they built their own house like in pieces over many, many decades. It's quirky and fun and like feels homey and warm, and like there, but the landscape is there too. And she's a bit on a bluff. You can kind of look out onto
Mm,
the nature, which is my connection with the other place. I live in Seattle area, not far from the Puget Sound, maybe half a mile. So I run out to this other bluff that's an old quarry, actually. It's called the Richmond Beach Saltwater Park. And I run out there usually a couple times a week, and I see the vista, right? You're up
mhm,
on the ridge, you look down at the water. Everybody's never been to Seattle. It's the most beautiful place in the world, I think. And you look across the Puget Sound and you see the Olympic Mountains, and you got water and mountains, and you kind of got it all. I joke that, like, the Northwest is in science fiction when people destroy the planet Earth and we have to go find another planet like Earth. It looks like the Pacific
It
Northwest when
looks
we
like
get
the
there.
Pacific
I mean,
Northwest.
it
Yes.
helps that most science fiction of those types of stories are filmed in Vancouver. So
Right.
that's probably why. But but inherently, I think there's this instinctual piece in a bucolic landscape of being able to. And I saw a presentation about this actually from anthropologists, and it's because we feel safe when we have a view that we can see where danger is coming from. When we have view
Prospect.
it includes water because we know we need water to survive. So if you have a view where you can see around you and you're not claustrophobic and you see water, like both of those things, whether that's in the Northwest and looking over the Puget Sound, or whether you're, in some other region and you're looking over a lake or a river, like you're going to feel more at peace. That's just biological. So it gets we talk about biophilic design and stuff like this. And I'm sure you had a podcast that talked about it. It's similar to that. And so those are my special places. Both have those pieces. I would say the Northwest has that natural beauty piece that really strikes me. So does the Southwest, but that there's always a home there with my mother-in-law. So that's important.
This has been fantastic. Vince, thanks so much for the chat today. I've really enjoyed hearing both your perspective of the future, of the past, that it revolves around people. This can be such technical work so often, and there's so much time and effort that goes into the craft, but it really is for the people. And so I really appreciate the reflection there. I hope you'll come back for another chat. Thanks to our friends and colleagues, Aaron McDade and Andrew Lee, for helping me on a little of the content and questions here. They were great guides. And I will be very happy to share information about Architecture 2030 and the Bushwick Book Club. I'm looking forward to seeing you in a few weeks there at that event. And just thanks again for joining me here in another episode of Net Podsitive.
Well, thanks for having me, Richard. It was real fun to spend some time. Just talk.
All right. Well, looking forward to seeing you again. Thanks so much, Vince. And we'll see you all again soon.